I use the word mind as a synonymous of phenomenal consciousness. In other words, if there is a mind, then there is something it is like to be. If a state is mental, then there is something it is like to be in that state. There are qualities associated with it. Mind is that whose excitations are what we call experiences. Every experience is an excitation of a mind. So mind is that whose excitations are experiences.
So mind is experiencing, according to your definition?
Yeah, if you have an experience, there has to be a subject of experience. There has to be a dative of experience, that to which experience is given. So we can call that mind, but we have to avoid creating the idea that there are two things, the experience and the mind that experiences. Because if you do that, then you run into all kinds of philosophical problems. Like you can't make sense of why a mind, which is different from an experience, why that mind experiences anything, since experience is something else. You run into the interaction problem of dualism. So to avoid that, the way to think about it is to think of experiences as, say, the vibrations of a guitar string, and of mind as the guitar string. Or to think of experiences as ripples on a lake, and mind as the lake. Because if you do that, and then you realize that there is nothing to a ripple but the lake doing something. You can't take the ripple home with you, take it out of the lake. You can't take the note produced by a guitar string home with you and leave the guitar string behind. There's nothing to the note but the guitar string in movement. There is nothing to the ripple but the lake in movement. In the same way, there's nothing to experience but mind in movement. And then you avoid dualisms, you avoid all kinds of problems like the interaction problem, and everything sort of ties up neatly at the end.
And yet, the mainstream model of things is that the ripple creates the lake, right? Insofar as what we experience, so we experience a brain, we perceive a brain, we see a brain, we can touch a brain. I've never done it, but you could probably smell a brain, etc. And from that, most people, 99% of people believe, without, in most cases, I've realized, without even realizing they believe it, assume that the brain creates mind. But there's no evidence for that. That is a belief, not a fact, isn't it?
I think when it began, it was understandable. I think it's unforgivable today for 21st century thinkers. I think it's unforgivable to insist on what is now obviously an error, but its start is understandable. Oh, by the way, brains do smell. I'm not going to get into it, but they do smell. The origin of the belief is a kind of lazy thinking. It's a face value thinking. There are obvious correlations between brain activity, which is measurable and physical in the colloquial sense, meaning that you can describe it through numbers, and experiences on the other hand. These two are very nicely correlated. They are not fully correlated. We're probably not going to get into this today, but as far as this question is concerned, we could even pretend that they are fully always correlated. It will still work well, what I'm about to say. And of course, the easiest explanation for A and B being correlated is that A causes B or B causes A. And because we are in a materialist society, well, we think matter causes mind as opposed to mind causing matter. Of course, the third option is A and B are both caused by C, but that gets more involved and complicated. So this is the first line of argument, face value argument, lazy, vulgar thinking, as we say in philosophy. Vulgar doesn't mean morally bad. It means superficial, unsophisticated, face value thinking. The two are correlated, so one must generate the other. And then the second argument would be the illusion of causation, which presupposes a form of dualism. And it goes like this. If I take a very physical needle and I stick it in your arm, you will experience pain. So a material cause leads to a mental effect. Therefore, matter causes mind, because it's the effect that is mental. and the cause is material. Now, this is even worse because it's not even face value thinking. It's just mistaken reasoning because it presupposes dualism. It presupposes a physical cause and a mental effect that are in different ontological domains. An idealist would say everything is mind. There is only mental to mental causation. The needle you see is a dashboard representation of a mental process. Sticking that needle in your arm means that you're bringing that external mental process into your internal mentation. And that has a mental effect called pain. So it's mental cause, mental effect. There's no issue here. That's how an idealist would think. The problem with these two face value arguments is that it creates an insoluble problem. Because how can something that is exhaustively describable in terms of numbers, namely physical stuff, the brain, you can put a numerical description of the position, charge, momentum of every single elementary particle in your brain. So you can have a fully quantitative description of the brain. You will have said, with a list of the right numbers, everything there is to be said about what it is to be a brain. Not what it is like, but what a brain is. And yet you will have said nothing about the qualities of experience. You can't describe what it is like to be heartbroken with a list of numbers. You can't describe what it is like to see red with a list of numbers. Oh, Bernardo, 375 terahertz. No, that tells me nothing about what it is like to actually see red. You gave me a description of the physical world, but you didn't describe the experience of seeing red. If I were colorblind and I couldn't see red, you would have told me nothing about what it is like to see red by giving me a number. And this explanatory gap from physicality to mentation is a big problem. In modern language, it's called the hard problem of consciousness, which is not hard. It's impossible because it's an inner contradiction of a wrong line of thinking. If you say the brain causes the mind, you cannot have an impassable chasm between the two. You have to be able to bridge them. And it has been shown that it's not only in practice impossible to bridge them, it's impossible in principle. In other words, it's senseless. And the reason is so obvious. Physicality, we invented numbers to describe the contents of perception. Numbers are a description. Like you want to describe to somebody what it will feel like to lift a heavy piece of luggage. You can say 50 kilograms. It's a description of an experience. And if you want to describe what it is like to drive from my home to Munich, like I'll have to do in January, you could describe that by saying 800 kilometers. But that's a description of an experience. It is not a thing. There are no 50 kilograms in and of itself. 50 kilograms is a description. It's like a map that describes a territory. But then we try to say that the descriptions precede the thing described. We try to say that the map precedes the territory, and if you reach into the map, you can pull the territory out of it. That's what we are doing when we try to say the brain creates the mind. Well, no, the brain is a map of the mind. It's an appearance on a dashboard that can be described. But it's not the thing in itself. It's a description. If you give ontological precedence to the description, you will fall into an error. You can't recover the territory from the map, right? You start from the territory and then you describe it through the map. So when we try to say, how can we bridge from brain to mind, we are trying to extract the territory from the map. We are trying to put the descriptions ahead of the thing described. And that's why it's impossible. That's why it's not the hard problem of consciousness, but the impossible, incoherent problem of consciousness. And you can account for all the correlations by just saying, no, the brain is not what causes the mind. The brain is what the mind looks like when a mind is observed from the outside. And they are still fully correlated. And all causation is mental. So the needle is not a thing. The needle is a representation of a mental process that works as a mental cause to a mental effect, feeling the pain when you stick the needle in my arm. Everything closes nicely without leading to any of these impossible problems if we think of the entirety of nature as mental processes.